Hi all, this is Dr. Tracy here in CISGAME 1. This is the first part of a three-part series of videos discussing formal elements. Just like the announcement says this week, we are working on formal elements. So if you take a look at the formal elements page, it's going to show you just a PowerPoint, and that's about it. There isn't much here. And so I need to give you more information about that, and we're going to go over it by using the textbook. So I'm bringing the textbook up so you can discuss each one of those. Part of what needs to be done this week is the discussion. And in the discussion that I have assigned for this week, you're asked to do exercises that come directly out of the textbook. And so the discussion 3 on formal elements will be 3 exercises that are coming out of the textbook, which is 3.3, 3.4, and 3.5. Interaction patterns, objectives, and procedures. So I'm going to go over each one of these, and this first one will be about interaction patterns. So going on over to the textbook, Chapter 3 is called Working with Formal Elements. The main thing to understand about formal elements is they are elements that form the structure of the game. Without them, games cease to be games. This is important to know that you have certain elements that have to be a part of your game. And when you create formal elements, they define the game. If you saw any kind of exercise, if you think about any other game, you would realize that games without players aren't games at all. Games without objectives aren't really games at all. Games without rules or procedures are not games at all. So those are the main kind of things that are included as formal elements in what you're discussing this week. In addition, things like resources, conflict, boundaries, outcomes are all part of the essence of a game. And if you were to remove some of these basic concepts of the game, you don't have a game. So let's start by talking about players. This first video, I want to talk about player interaction levels. Games, as we saw in previous chapters, are experiences that are designed for players, that players must voluntarily accept the rules and constraints of the game in order to play. So when you have players, you have certain characteristics about those players that defines who they are. First of all, the number of players is going to make a difference in the player interaction in the game. Is there 1 player? Is there 2 players? Is there 3 players? Is there 17 million players? The way that you define the role of the player will make a big difference in the way that the game is structured. And by changing the number of players, it inevitably changes the game fundamentally. So the roles of the players may be the same or they may be different in all cases. Like, for example, the role in Monopoly or chess is going to be the same whichever side or color you play on, or whether you want to take the little doggy or the top hat. But in something like a role-playing game, you might have a different role in your game than someone else. You might play a healer as opposed to a fighter. The different types of roles that are defined within the game is what's going to make up what's called player interaction patterns. And player interaction patterns are the way that you determine how many players and what are their roles within the games that you're developing. So one player interaction pattern is a single player versus the game. And this is that basic structure where you log into a game and you just play it. So that just means something like Pac-Man or whatever, that you go on, you play it, you're done. Maybe you won, maybe you lost. Maybe there's some kind of win condition, but your player interaction is you versus the game. A second type of player interaction pattern would be multiple players versus the game. Now, this usually happens either asynchronous or synchronous. Social games are asynchronous. Maybe you play Candy Crush or Farmville or whatever, some Facebook games that online, and you're trying to get a higher score than your friend. Now you're working together, you're not working against each other, but it is comparing how you both are doing along the way. That's a multiple individual asynchronous players versus games. Synchronous would be similar, except for you're all doing it at the same time, something like bingo maybe. This is a non-competitive player interaction. Now, the third type is player versus player, and that is competitive interaction. That would be something like checkers or poker or whatever. Unilateral competition is a player interaction model that's a game structure in which 2 or more players compete against 1 player. Something like dodgeball would be unilateral competition, where there's one person that needs to be taken out. Another type of player interaction is multilateral competition, which means that there are 3 or more players that compete against each other. Instead of all against one, it's all against all. You can think of like Call of Duty or Halo 4. Online gameplay is usually what you refer to when you think of multilateral competition and multiplayer gaming. So you want to think in terms of thousands of players, but you could think in terms of 3 to 6 players, like an average board game. Another player interaction pattern is cooperative play. And this is the game structure where 2 or more players cooperate with each other in order to accomplish a certain task. And so sometimes you can see this with the development of games where you have to work in tandem to find the solution. A 7th one is team competition, where you all work together against a group of another people are all working together in order to get to a common goal. So that brings us to exercise 3.3, interaction patterns. And that's the discussion for this week, or at least part A of the discussion for this week. For each of the interaction patterns, create a list of your favorite games in each pattern. If you can't think of any games, find some and play them. But I really want you to just kind of tell me, these are the interaction patterns for the list of games that I like. And that's what you'll write up for the first part of discussion 3. And so I'd like you to do that now if you're listening to this video. And once this is over, you can go on to the next one. Talk to you soon.